I have the great opportunity to help facilitate a conversation with Vu Lei. And for those of you who don't know Vu, you're in for a treat over the next hour of great conversation, important perspectives, a fair amount of humor, and I guarantee some important provocation. I have spent the majority of my time here in Seattle supporting the local nonprofit community in Western Washington nonprofit community. And I've been involved in all the organizations in our region and have done a fair amount of mentoring and training. And Vu's voice has been an extraordinarily important one for a very long time in our sector. So give me just a moment to give you a brief bio of Vu, and then we're going to jump into this conversation. I need reading glasses. Vu Lei is a writer, speaker, vegan, Pisces, and the former executive director of the Rainier Valley Corps, a nonprofit in Seattle that promotes social justice by developing leaders of color, strengthening organizations led by communities of color, and fostering collaboration between diverse communities. Vu's passion to make the world better, combined with a low score on the law school admissions test, drove him to the field of nonprofit work, where he learned that we should take the work seriously, but not ourselves. There's tons of humor in the nonprofit world, and someone needs to document it. He is going to do that, and with the hope that one day a TV producer will see how cool and interesting our field is and make a show about nonprofit work featuring attractive actors attending strategic planning meetings and filling 990 tax forms. Who will play Vu? That's the question. Known for his no BS approach, irreverent sense of humor, and love of unicorns, Vu has been featured in dozens, if not hundreds, of his own blog posts at Nonprofit AF. His blog was previously known as Fundraising with Balls. We love him for that. And I'm pleased to welcome Vu Lei to our conversation today with the Engagement Summer Session. Hello, Vu.
Good morning, Lee. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
There were a number of chats in the comments about yesterday's session. We're going to get to that, but I want to offer a congratulations yesterday on the launch of the community-centered fundraising effort. That's really fantastic, and that's going to have a lot to do with today.
Yeah.
Vu and I have agreed that this is going to be a conversation today, so I'm going to ask him some questions. I have no doubt he'll ask me some questions. We're going to do our best to take questions and input from you all, and the team is going to try to feed that to me in multiple different ways. So, Vu, here's my first question, which is to really tell us about yourself. How has your commitment to an equity-centered approach to your work changed how you lead and how you think about the role of philanthropy?
Thank you so much, Lee. And thank you again, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And I got my snake plant in the back. Psychologically, it's designed to make you feel like I'm approachable. And it's, yeah. So I'm really glad to be here. My story, I was born in Vietnam. My father fought against the communists and he was put into re-education camp. Vietnam has its own history of colonization. We took over the Champa Kingdom and there is a reckoning with that as well. And we fled Vietnam, and it was really rough just being here in the United States, being an immigrant kid and adjusting to life over here. And I didn't really appreciate just what my family went through. But I think one story that really affected how I think about equity and our role in it is my older sister, who was one of the kids who were born from U.S. soldiers who came over, and these Amerasian kids were just completely discriminated against, and some of them were abandoned on the streets. And my adopted sister was one of them, and we brought her back to our village, and she remained there, but she still faced a lot of prejudice and discrimination for looking different, and for being born from the wrong father. And she told me that she could not actually go to school. They would not let her go to school in my village. But she really wanted to go to school. And so she would stand by the window with her notebook and learn at the window while other kids were inside. Even when it rained and we have heavy monsoon rain, she would still stand there at the window learning to read and write in Vietnamese. And that story just affects how I think about things, because I feel like a lot of us are inside the room. And there are a lot of people standing at the window who are just trying their best to survive. And if we are in the room, then we have an obligation to open the door and to open the windows. But so many of us are the ones who are unintentionally probably closing the door on people. So my immigrant experience growing up in Vietnam and then over here has really shaped the way that I think about our roles and our privileges that we have in doing this work. I would love to hear about your story, Lee.
My story is a prototypical middle-class white American story for a while. I grew up in East Central Indiana, the third child of parents who stayed married. I grew up in a small town of mostly white people. I had a few friends of color, but it was a very white experience, and I thought that was everyone's experience growing up. I just thought that's how the world was. My father fought in the Korean War and didn't find a way to college, but I always grew up knowing I was going to go to college. That was just the expectation. So I am a first-generation college kid who went to a big public university in the Midwest. Go Hoosiers. That's an awful lot like the University of Washington. And it's one of the reasons I have such a passion about higher education, because that was my experience. I went to school on a lot of scholarships. I was very involved in my college experience. And it was in college that I found my way out as a gay man. And so that part of my journey was complicated, but listen, my parents always loved me. I got through all of that. I never felt abandoned. And so again, in that experience, I had the prototypical white family experience. But I'm also a gay man of a particular age, and AIDS devastated my community. When I was 27, my partner died of AIDS. And that was a very complicated journey. And that experience is what led me to the nonprofit world, because I recognized that I could no longer work in the corporate sector. I had to find a way to do work that I felt like was empowering people in the world and doing good in my community, and that my vocation needed to become my avocation. And so I became I talked my way into the first development director job at a small nonprofit in Dallas that served the gay and lesbian community and worked with communities of color, because at that point in Dallas, where I lived, it was gay men and Black people who were dealing with the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And I spent 4 years doing that work in Dallas. And that work was what brought Bill and me to Seattle in 1996, when I became the major gifts officer for the Northwest AIDS Foundation. I did that work for a few more years here in Seattle and found my way to UW. But it was my own journey and my own recognition of the impact I needed to have on the community that led me to the nonprofit world. And I've been at UW for 20 years now in a multitude of positions. For me, Vu, one of the things that you said that's so powerful is how your lens is one that I don't see, and I have to work really hard to make sure I'm thinking about all the time. And your notion of windows and doors is one that I have to focus on consciously every day. And so I'm glad for the reminder. So I appreciate your question, Vu. Can you take just a couple of minutes and tell us about the community-centered fundraising effort? And let's start with how many people were signed up for your launch yesterday, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Yeah, we had 2,700 people attend yesterday's webinar. I was hoping for 1,000 people. So 2,700 people was a lot. It was very exciting, but it did crash our website a couple of times. So yeah, it was really good. I feel like our sector is ready for this sort of new imagining of what fundraising could be. I want to say, first of all, though, that I really appreciate fundraisers. I'm one of them. We all do amazing work. Yesterday, I was joking that we're like on a show of Chopped, right? Where on Chopped, you're given a basket of ingredients and random ingredients, and you're expected to make these amazing meals out of them. So it's like, here's a trout and some marshmallow peeps, go and make dessert or something like that. And oftentimes this is like fundraisers. We're like given a basket of random stuff. Here's a CRM that's 5 years old, and here's a website that's updated by your board member's nephew. You may not experience this in higher education, but this is what's going on in the rest of the field. And here's $20 for canapes and go and end homelessness. That's basically fundraising in a nutshell in our sector. And fundraisers is just so brilliant and so creative all the time. I'm just impressed by how charismatic we all are. Obviously very attractive and extremely smart, right? And I'm just really impressed. At the same time, though, we have to acknowledge that in many ways we have to think about how we're complicit in perpetuating a lot of the things that we are raising money to fight. We exist in a system of white supremacy, anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, and xenophobia. And we just don't realize that we're swimming in this water, and our fundraising is affected by that. For example, we don't talk to our donors about how their wealth might have come from colonization and slavery. And we just, and maybe they should just give most of this money back or all of it back. But instead, what we do is we ask them to feel really good about supporting a cause, and then we thank them for it. And then they can be merry on their way and not think about where their wealth came from and whether this money should have been theirs in the first place. And then we perpetuate this nonprofit Hunger Games while doing that, where everyone is scrambling, fighting with one another for resources and donors and things. And that is not how we're going to address systemic injustice, by creating this Hunger Games and getting donors to not think about systemic injustice. So this is the revolution that is coming for fundraising, and I'm really excited about that.
Ooh, that's such compelling language about how to think about these things. And when we were preparing for our conversation today, we talked a little bit about how UW is so large and is such a behemoth and an organizational structure that looks very different than the small nonprofits that I grew up in and some of the small nonprofits that you grew up in. And our capacity to flex and change has not been as easy, or at least perceived to be as easy. And one of the things that is so compelling about what you're doing in the community-centered fundraising work and some of the conversations is how to have these conversations and think about these conversations with donors. One of the things that's made UW very successful, and I shared numbers with you when we talked, really extraordinarily powerful numbers of how people feel compelled to support UW and to send their philanthropy this way. But a large focus of our success has been around this notion of donor centricity. Many of us in the profession know Penelope Burke is sort of the queen of donor-centric work. And that's largely how UW has been focused in the past about how we do this work. Can you tell us about your perspective on donor-centric fundraising and the opportunities to change in that space and how to think about this world differently? Because that's not how we think now.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I do appreciate just donor-centered fundraising for many of the good things it has done, right? It has brought in a lot of resources into many different causes that we all care about. And it has, in many ways, reversed some of the bad practices we've had in the past, where we ignored donors and didn't pay attention and we were very self-centered. The problem is that the pendulum has swung way to one side, where now I have seen blog posts that literally say things like your donors are literally the center of your world. First of all, they're using literally wrong, which is very annoying to me, right? But they're like, donors are heroes. Our only job is to get our donors, these heroes, these magnanimous, amazing people, to support this and get them to connect it to things that they care about, because they're the ones who make things happen. And we are just a conduit to things. And I think that is a dangerous sort of philosophy to have. None of us should be in the center. The collective community that we are in should be the center. But the problem is that it works. You know, it does work. And that's the challenge, is that we are, not only does it work, but it creates the conditions for it to work, because we're conditioning donors to expect the same things. So then when we do those things that they expect, then it works, and then they continue to expect them. So we create this self-fulfilling prophecy in our engagement with donors. But the challenge that I see is that it avoids them thinking about, it allows them to avoid thinking about many more difficult things like racism, like xenophobia, and so this is why we have more donors giving money to, dog shelters and animal causes, which is great. I'm a vegan, I totally support these. But it should not be easier. Like, for example, with the race incident with Amy Cooper, calling the police on a black man who was bird watching, Christian Cooper, right? People were more concerned about the dog that she was strangling than the black man whose life she was threatening with violence and death here. And in many ways, it's because we have conditioned our donors to care more about certain things, because we reaffirm them, we reward them for caring about certain things by giving them little micro and reinforcement through our handwritten thank you notes, our calls, etc. this is probably the most controversial thing that I'll probably say, is that I kind of see donor-centered fundraising like husband-centered marriages, let's say, right? I'm a husband. I would love it if my partner sends me a note saying, Vu, and every time I do the dishes, she'll write me a note saying, Vu, thanks to you, our family is stronger because you did the dishes. We are now a stronger family. I'm like, yes, if I get a thank you note every single time I did the dishes, then yeah, I would totally, I'm like, oh, I feel so appreciated. I'm going to do the dishes every single day. But no, I am a partner, an equal partner in this marriage, and I need to do the dishes whether or not I am thanked for it. And yeah, we should thank one another in a good marriage, but we should also be able to say, hey, you know what, you screwed up there. And what you did over there is not good, and we need to think about the future of our children and stuff. But donor-centered fundraising is just one partner chasing after the other, constantly thanking them forever. And then, yes, the chores keep being done and they feel really good about that. But it just feels superficial and it does not get to the heart of what we're trying to do as a sector, which is to address systemic injustice. And that means addressing slavery and colonization and the murder of Black people and the murder of Black trans people and murder and missing Indigenous women and kids in cages right now. So we have to address those things, and we can't just go around thanking people all the time.
Vu, I'm sure there are snaps across all of this Zoom call now. Thank you for the passion you had in that question. I do want to share with you, though, in my house, it is a very husband-centric environment. So that works in my house. I can't say that for everybody else's house, but it does work for me. You are appropriately and thoughtfully provoking us to think about the work that we do and the way we go about our donor centricity. And you're calling out lots of questions that are there. And you and I had talked about the fact that the evolution of how we do things at UW is something that we're really leaning into and trying to figure out how to do anew. And the thoughts you're sharing with us today are going to be fodder for that conversation. There are two particular threads I want to plumb with you with this frame that you've raised. Question one is, how can a fundraiser at the University of Washington, from your perspective, bring to her focus an equity lens in these kinds of conversations with donors? The second part of it is, how can the UW think about standing up priorities, opportunities for engagement that have that same lens, that help us marry what donors may want to do to advance society in a way that creates the kind of change that UW can be a factor in? In other words, how do we create the kinds of equity-centered priorities at our university that will attract the kinds of philanthropic investment that can help move that forward?
Well, thank you, Lee, for two very complicated questions simultaneously.
I did my best.
I can talk on forever about this. I would also love to hear your perspectives, Lee, about this, because it is kind of a new framework to things, and I would love to hear your concerns about things, because there are a lot of concerns. We haven't figured out everything, and we have to explore this thing. But how does yeah, go ahead.
So let's talk about this question about fundraisers first, and let me be super honest about where we are. And this is a question that one of my colleagues posed to me at some point in the recent days. When we're in conversations with our older, wealthier donors who significantly skew white, who significantly skew male, the opportunity to bring a racial lens, an equity lens to these conversations and to provoke those conversations are complicated and feels like we might be in a position to alter a relationship, damage a relationship. Those are complicated spaces. We want to try to arm our frontline staff and frankly, everybody in our work who is externally facing. And there's a whole lot of us in our session who are not fundraisers, who are externally facing. And so I'd be interested in your perspective, because this is something I don't know how to talk about yet at UW. How do we bring this question of equity to our work in such a way that we feel empowered to talk to people, not just be in service to the great thanking that you spoke to before?
Thanks, Lee. Deidre confirmed that with something called elephant bumping. I've never heard of that. What is elephant bumping?
It is the notion of influential, wealthy people intersecting with influential, wealthy people.
Oh, I had never heard. I just learned something new here. This is great. This is definitely a challenge. What I would probably say is I would ask you, how have you been engaging with the wealthy older white donors? How has it?
Equity
Yeah.
lens. In all candor, without an equity lens. If that is someone's issue, and that's where someone wants to go, absolutely I engage in that conversation. But have I, as a fundraiser, taken a position of provocation and or bringing that issue to those people? No, I have not. And that is absolutely something I need to change. But in all candor, I don't, and I haven't.
Well, thank you, Leah. I appreciate that. I would say a few things for us to consider. One is, in many ways, we have been underestimating our donors. And this is the moment to actually engage, because in the past, remember, Black Lives Matter was a fringe movement that a lot of people just didn't pay any attention to. And now it seems that if you are not paying attention to it, then you are on the fringe in many ways, right? So this is now the moment for us to actually say, you know what, society is moving this direction. Have you seen the protests? Have you seen the statues coming down? We have to start talking about these things. So being able to find a new approach to actually talk to donors, but we have been underestimating because the donor-centered model, right? We think that donors are very fragile, and in many ways they are, but there are quite a few of them who are not and who are ready for these conversations. I have one donor friend who attended a workshop that asked her to analyze where her family's wealth came from. She discovered that it was from stealing land from a native family. And she decided now that when she gets her inheritance, she's going to give 100% of her inheritance back to the native community, right? Like in the past, that would never have happened. But now more and more people are actually having these conversations with donors. So I would say, yes, have these conversations with donors, maybe not all of them at the same time. You know, you might have to pick and choose the ones who might indicate that they're ready for a more challenging conversation. Invite them to conversation. I have another group who sent out Ijeoma Ulo's the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, to their major donors and had a book club to talk about this as a soft intro into this, right? So we can do that. The other thing is, though, that equity requires us to think about what we are willing to give up, right? You and I are dudes. We are used to being able to just like apply to any jobs because we think that we're competent at everything, even when we're not. Okay. And so dudes are out there applying to jobs that we don't qualify for. And now there has to be a movement to say, you know what, maybe dudes should like not apply as much. Cisgender men need to just not apply for things. Well, this sort of idea of what we need to give up in terms in acknowledgement of our privilege is really important. Like my friend is giving up her inheritance to repair for the damage, the harm caused to the native community. Then you and I have to think about that. At the same time, our fundraising approach has to be the same thing. Maybe you've raised $760 million this year, but are you willing to raise $500 million, losing $260 million if it means you're going to be able to advance a more equitable society? That is something that every department of development has to think about now. Not just raising as much money as possible, which it has been our primary directive, is raising as much money as possible. And now our directive has to be, that's no longer good enough. It has to be, what is the benefit to our society? If we can do better with $500 million raised than $760 million raised, then that is something that we should aim for.
That notion of measuring by impact as opposed to dollars is one that we have been talking about, Vu, and I think is a very provocative one, and that is an institutional change that we are exploring and need to lean into even more. I want to make a couple of quick points. One is remind folks that the question asking opportunities through thought exchanges there, so don't miss the chance to do that. There's been a couple of questions that have risen that I want to pose to you, Vu, from participants in the audience. And Dave Isle raises something, or David Chow, one of the two, I can't remember, flew by. And I want to be really clear to say this. Though I don't always think about the equity lens in my conversations with donors. We have extraordinary folks on our staff who are focused on these questions through our alumni and student engagement efforts, through the work of the Office of Minority Affairs and Diversity, from equity efforts related all across campus. There are people who bring this focus on a daily basis. And I want to acknowledge them and not miss the chance to say that there is a portion of us whose job is to seek philanthropic support for the university's effort to address these questions. And those teams have been doing this in a significant way for a long period of time, and all of us rally when we can. my response about my work was specific to what I do or don't do. So I don't want to give the impression that to all of my colleagues across campus who do amazing work in this space and are focused on this in this space, and our own educational internal opportunities are strong. So Leilani Lewis is now leading our new equity council, the work going on in our equity club for people who want to take the personal journey of understanding how they have been part of this racist society that's endemic to who we are and our ability to change that. All of that is there. So I want to acknowledge those things, Vu. And I do want to say to you that one of the things that I think is true for those of us who have a relationship with donors is the capacity to engage them in conversation is something most of them really appreciate. The opportunity to bring new ideas to them for people who want to make a difference in the world. And I truly believe that most people who are engaged in philanthropy at whatever level are doing it because they care about making a difference in the world. Many people see UW as a vector to do that. I've had lots of conversations personally where I've been able to say to donors, tell me what you care about. Tell me about what you aspire to the future to look like and how can we help you figure out how to get there. Reframing that kind of conversation with some of the stuff you said earlier is something that I took to heart, and I will be thinking about how to do that in a different sort of way. So I appreciate that provocation. Let me zip to another screen where there are questions. Here's one. Vu, do you think meaningful philanthropy can be achieved through a digital or broad-based focus? And what are the challenges in that spaces related to equity?
Digital or broad-based, this is definitely not my area of expertise at all. I do appreciate something that Beth Cantor, who's another leader in the sector, mentioned about algorithmic discrimination. So many of the algorithms are driven by, again, white men. And so that affects the algorithms that are being developed and who gets recognized. So many of the platforms that we use, the technologies that we use are also inherently very racist. And we don't think about that. We don't think that Zoom is racist. We don't think about, all the CRMs that we're using might be problematic in this way. But I think that we do have to think about, even as we go about doing more digital stuff in this pandemic crisis, that we still have many challenges. Many people are not able to access digital conversations, virtual conversations. So we have to be able to think about that in a way as well. But again, this is definitely not my area of expertise. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I have the great privilege to support many of the teams at the center of the university that are focused on digital engagement, looking at our platforms and outreach through annual philanthropy and annual advancement analytics. And I am learning in this space, also not my great strength. I'm struck by your notion that racism in the algorithms. Algorithmic racism was a new phrase to me, and both it made me smile and pause because I think about what's going on with Facebook as a social media platform and how the algorithms are so significantly effective in that space. And I see that Kara's commenting on this, who leads our analytics team around these algorithmic racism pieces. So I'm with you. It's an area that I'm learning on. But what we know at the University of Washington is we have to figure out how to capitalize on the digital engagement strategies to do more work at scale that will allow us to focus on a different kind of engagement than perhaps what we've done in the past, to reach more people, to be more efficient, to think about how we deliver those messages. So that's going to be a good thread for us to hold on to. I noticed another comment from my colleague Sue Hayes-McQueen saying snaps up on the question of it here that we have to figure out in this space. So I'm with you. Thanks for that input on that question. I want to ask you to, if you can, as a fundraiser now, putting your fundraiser hat on, any best advice or thoughts about how someone as a fundraiser can weave this notion of equity lens into conversations, how to address those kinds of conversations, what to say, what to think about, how to see those cues to open those discussions?
Yeah, first of all, we have to acknowledge that we suck at talking about these issues. We have not been trained to talk about them. We took like a year. And they're, particularly for white people, a very complicated, uncomfortable space to be that many choose to avoid. Yeah, it is. And also, again, we're not trained on it. We took a year of trigonometry, right? With the sines and the cosines. And I don't know how many of us actually use trigonometry in our daily lives, right? Except tangents, which I'm going on one right now. But the point is, we are trained in certain things and not other things. We're not trained to talk about race and class and sexism and misogyny and things like that. And so it is very hard for us to talk about these things. So we need to be grounded in this. And I do like Jay Smooth's philosophy. He's a thought leader and a hip hop artist. And he talks about how we need to move away from this tonsillectomy model of talking about racism, and where it's like we attend one workshop and one anti-racism workshop, and it's like we got our racist tonsils removed, and now we can never be racist again. And then we get really offended when someone says, hey, actually what you said is kind of racist. And you're like, how dare you? I attended UIR training 5 years ago. I can never be racist again. He encourages us to move towards the dental hygiene model, talking about race, where we look in the mirror every single day and brush and floss the racism and things out of our teeth every single day. And someone says, hey, you got a little bit of racism stuck in your teeth. You don't get offended. You go, oh, thank you for pointing that out. I really appreciate that. I'm going to go look in the mirror and I'm going to floss it out. And we have to do that every single day because we're all going to make mistakes all the time. And does it mean that we're horrible people? No, because we all are going to get stuff stuck in our teeth, right? We're only horrible people if we stop looking in the mirror. And we're just like, no, I don't believe you. I don't have anything stuck in my teeth. And no, don't you ever look at my teeth ever again. Like that's when we become like not helpful to the world, right? So Jay Smooth, I really love his analogy, and I talk about it all the time. So we got to do a much better job doing that. And then we need to explore this with our donors, right? We don't do this with our donors. And we put up with racist, sexist things from our donors all the time because our mandate has been to raise as much money as possible. And so if that's our mandate, if that's our prime directive, to use a Star Trek analogy, then we are going to always think about what will bring us as much money. And that means, we're not going to offend our donors. But if our prime directive is justice and equity, then we have to start figuring out ways to talk to our donors about these things and saying, you know what, we really appreciate your money, but I do have to give you some feedback. What you said over there, that was racist. I know you didn't mean to, but here's the impact that it has on our communities. And we would love to talk to you about this. Right? And that's much harder.
Boo, I want to stop for a minute and acknowledge what you just said. First, I want to acknowledge the notion of equity dental floss. I'm taking it back to my dentist. It's going to be a new brand and there's great value in that. Thank you for equity dental floss.
Jay Smooth.
Jay Smooth. The last bit of what you just said, so powerful, so important for us all to hear, because UW has been driven and it's bent to do good. I want to fully acknowledge that no one was intending not to do good in this space. The conversation has been focused on how do we acquire and inspire additional resources to advance this university without the questions that you just posed. I will acknowledge and share, I remember a donor who is now deceased, so still no names, but when I would talk to this donor, I would be on the phone. When donor X would start on his racist rants, I would do this with the phone, wait till he stopped talking and re-engage, and I would just ignore it. Because I thought my job at the moment and my job at that time was to sustain that relationship and ensure that those resources kept flowing to do the good work that they were doing, because they were funding students, they were funding things that mattered. And then he would go on another racist tirade and I would do this. I did not address it. I can't speak on behalf of the whole University of Washington, but the gauntlet you just threw down about how do we think about changing the value proposition of philanthropy from the value of numbers exclusively to the power of what it can accomplish in good as it relates to what we want to try to do to advance the world is a really important conversation for us to wrestle. And that's not just about advancement. That's about the leadership of the university, the opportunities that we have. Those are hard transformational questions, but we are calling the question. And I never say it quite right, but James Baldwin is a personal hero. And one of the things that I reflect on regularly, particularly during the last bit of time, has been not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced. And we have to hold on to that mantra. So I want to thank you for throwing down that gauntlet just now about that, because this community needs to wrestle with that question in a very significant way. So
I mean, it's a gauntlet, but it's also an opportunity, right?
totally.
I mean, people are ready for this. I mean, the corporations, Ben and Jerry's, Nike's, and you know, like everyone has to embrace these conversations now. And in many ways, it is a way to actually to get donors engaged in a way that we haven't done before. And we are all terrified of losing funding by doing these things. But we've seen examples of things of it actually working, right? Like I think the Girls Club, Girl Scouts, for example, they had a donor, a major donor, who offered $100,000, but only if they agreed to not serve transgender girls. And they said, well, screw you. We're not gonna do that. That's against our mission and our values. And so they rejected $100,000. And they went onto social media and said, you know what? We had this asshole donor who took away $100,000, who would refuse not to give $100,000 if you know. And so can you help us raise this $100,000? And they got $300,000. So no, you may lose that donor. You say, hey, you know what? You're actually racist, and if you continue being this way, we cannot take any of your money because it's racist. And I know, and we appreciate what you've been doing in the past, but we can't. This is not good. It's racist. And yes, so yeah, you may lose that donor, but you will probably gain a whole bunch more because you took that stand for equity and justice.
Vu, I'm trying to track all the questions that are coming my way, and I want to acknowledge to everybody on this call that Amy is doing a great job of curating those questions, and I can't possibly get to them all. So I am using moderator's prerogative to choose the ones that I'm going to pose to you. And one I'd like to ask you to spend a moment on recognizing that this is a largely white institution with largely white people in leadership who care about making transitions, and we're all trying to figure out how we can do that in collaboration with one another, trying to listen to the voices of people of color and people who have been on this journey in different ways than we have to inform who we are.
Well, Lee, before we get to that, I would love to just hear your perspective. Why are you all so white? Why is UW so white?
I think it's so one of the it's a great question. I don't know that I have the definitive answer. I can give you my own suppositions about the evolution of this industry. I think it's a level of intentionality. I don't think that we have intentionally set, we are in the process of it and have done it for some years, not to say that it has not been a priority, but we have not intentionally said, how are we going to change the representation and inclusion at our institutions? And I think that is true across the sector, particularly in higher ed. Higher ed, even while the rest of the nonprofit sector, particularly advancement, has been very female focused, leadership in higher ed across the country has been white male dominated. And I think that's because it has been more of a corporate kind of structure, more sales oriented kind of structure. So I think it's about the historical way that our sector has been built and grown, not from a lack of willingness to try to make a good impact, or a belief that education is a vibrant and important vector to help make sustained change. But I think it has to do with where we've been in the history, and I think it requires a new level of intentionality moving forward to do it differently.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate that. Yeah, all of these systems are interrelated. We have a lot of issues with HR policies. Many HR policies are discriminating against people. And in fact, higher education has been used as a way to discriminate. We still have, in the rest of the field, development jobs that require a BA or a master's, right? And it's like, why? What if someone is a brilliant fundraiser who was not able to finish their formal education, right? And so I do feel like that higher education has a role to play in pointing out that, yes, higher education is amazing. I got my master's degree. I'm very proud of it. Right? But at the same time, we can't use this as a way to discriminate against other people either, who may not have had the chance or the resources to finish their formal education.
In my own journeys these days, as I work on my own anti-racism and towards an eventual hopeful understanding that I'm a better ally than I was, I've only recently come to understand how job descriptions, in and of themselves, and the way we write them, disinclude and disenfranchise people who come from diverse backgrounds. and thinking about traditional ways to talk about our work, to focus on the impact and not the experience, to look for people who bring those sorts of perspectives. I didn't have an appreciation about how job descriptions disinclude and disenfranchise people who would want to pursue those perspectives. That's a part of my learning and something I think is just the tip of the iceberg. And I know I have a lot more work to do in that space. I think higher ed, because we are more, and all of my colleagues on this call do not kill me, more corporatized than small nonprofit. For those of you who have not worked in small nonprofit work or mid-sized nonprofit work, the parallels are almost non-existent between what we do at UW every day and what Vu has done and what I used to do and what many of you who've worked in small nonprofits are. So I think that corporatization piece is a part of this, Vu.
Yeah, it is. It's really, I think it's really critical because I do feel like so many of the things that we want, this reimagining of what the world could be and how our practices could be different, has been stopped because the people who are pushing for these things are often not in power, right? And oftentimes we have a lot of people of color who come and say, you know what, we need to talk to our donors about racism. And the vastly white leadership team will say, no, because our white donors are not comfortable with it. What they really mean, and this is, I call it gatekeeper fragility, which is that people projecting their own fragility onto other people by saying, you know, those other people are not ready for these conversations, when what they mean is, we are not ready. I am not ready for these conversations.
Exactly.
So in order to really change and do community-centric type fundraising, we have to talk about HR policies and how do we actually bring more leaders of color and give them the power and autonomy to be able to make the decision. So I'm sorry, Lee, I derailed your questioning, but I would love
There
to
is no derailing here, Vule. These are conversations. I can't tell you the number of questions that are flowing and the enthusiasm around all of this. And I again want to acknowledge to everybody, I will not get to the vast majority of the thoughtful questions you're posing, but this is just the first session of a two half days, so there'll be lots of opportunities. We only have 9 minutes left, Vu. I'm very sad about that. I think that you and I could have this conversation for a couple more hours, or that might require a snack for me. Can you speak to a moment, from your perspective and your experience, what can UW do to create an environment where people of color, people who come from more equitable, diverse backgrounds, feel a sense of safety, comfort, and welcomeness? Because I'm not sure that let me take that back. I am sure we have not hit that mark. And I would be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, this is the work for all of us. And we have to acknowledge that many leaders of color, and I would say especially women of color, especially Black and Indigenous women, have been bringing up so many challenges over years. And we as a sector have ignored them, right? And oftentimes punished them for speaking up. And they get demoted and fired or not hired into the jobs. And it is terrible because I feel like leaders of color, especially women of color, are probably the biggest asset in our entire sector. And we don't create the space because we don't trust them. And we use every single tactic to avoid believing them, right, when they propose things. And we have to figure this out. I don't know. Well, I don't really have the answer to this, except we got to change all of our practices. We got to re-examine things. All of us who have privilege have to think about how are we taking up space. You know, like people ask my friends who are white, like, what are you willing to do? What are you willing to give up? And this has caused a lot of people to think, okay, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't apply for this job. Maybe I shouldn't apply for this grant. Maybe I should not take the microphone at this time. Maybe I should not sit on this board. It's really kind of think about not just what we do, but also what we are willing to not do and what we're willing to give up to create these spaces, right?
These are hard questions, and I ask it particularly because it's clear to me that is an issue for the university, that we have an opportunity to get better in that space. And I think every time we hear about it and we get a different perspective, it makes us more aware of what we can be doing and the constancy and continuity that's required, that when we bring people in, people of color, Black, Indigenous, people of color, whoever that looks like, we have to create space for them to feel a part of the community, to actively encourage and listen to their voices and value their perspectives. And so we're going to continue to do that good work.
Thank you, Lee. I would say it's not enough to listen, because actually many leaders of color are tired of being listened to because we're actually not being listened to. If it's like, here, can you tell us what you want, and we're going to listen to you, and then not implement anything that we
Right.
say, right? So no, we just need to trust people is what we need to do. Trust and provide them with resources and autonomy to carry out the solutions that they propose, because we're tired of being listened to and absolutely nothing happening. We're tired of going and putting on sticky notes on easel paper to vote on policies, and then those things are just never, because we're always outnumbered.
A powerful upgrade, Vule. Thank you. From beyond listening to acting on and trusting. That's a great upgrade. Thank you. We have just a few minutes. Here's my last question, moderator's prerogative. How can the UW connect better with the rest of the Pacific Northwest community to be aligned in this important space? And I ask this in the wake of launching CCF yesterday and the perspective you bring to this. How can UW bring its largesse, its influence to bear in partnership with the rest of the sector to do good work?
Yeah, I would say this is the challenge I've been seeing with higher education is you all are seen as the ivory tower. You're over there in this beautiful campus with the quads and the cherry blossoms, right? While the rest of us are out here fighting for staplers, you know? And so it's not enough for you to raise. This is one of the tenets of community-centric fundraising, is that your mission is not as important as the rest of the community. So that means that you have to be generous with other nonprofit organizations that are out there. So one, be where people are. We don't see a lot of UW folks, except when they're invited to give a speech or a lecture about the latest research or something. You all need to be on the ground, volunteering at soup kitchens and homeless shelters. You need to spend, and that needs to be like ingrained in your policies, which is like, we encourage our staff, our fundraisers, everyone to be out in the community, to spend more time in the community. So that's one thing, right? Also, you have a lot more resources and privilege and connections. Pass those on to organizations, introduce people to your donors, have events where you showcase a nonprofit partner and ask your existing donors to give money to them. You know, in your social media and newsletters, highlight the work of organizations that are doing good work so that other people in your alumni network can understand and see them as well. So we have to kind of end this sort of like, let's get as much money, let's get our donors to think only about UW and our system, and actually be outside the bubble. And I do think it's actually a lot more fun to be out there. It's fun. Find the joy of being in the community and not just like one corner of it, doing your own thing.
Vu, you have been an extraordinary gift to us this morning. We appreciate the chance to have this conversation. Personally, I love this conversation, and when it's possible, I look forward to buying you lunch and continuing this discussion when we can see each other in person. You have offered to us a significant number of ideas. You've challenged us to think differently about the days ahead. You have framed it in a sense of opportunity and optimism that acknowledges where we have been, but more importantly, challenges us to think about where we can go, and how we, the hundreds of us who are part of this university advancement enterprise, and those who are on this call who are our allies in this work, can think differently about how the University of Washington can be a great and powerful ally to advance the cause of equity and social justice. Thank you for that. I'd like to ask everybody to take their mute off for just a moment and a collective roar for Boulay and his willingness to join us this morning. Woo! All right, now mute yourselves again. Mute yourselves.
I do want to end, Lee, by saying that I really appreciate you all. I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and that would not have been possible without the scholarships that I got for being a poor kid. And a lot of that is because of you all raising money for kids like me, for people like me. And because of you, I was able to get my college degree and my master's degree. And it allowed me to continue doing this work. And so I just want to end by saying that I appreciate you all absolutely. And I'm excited about where our sector is going. And it's going to be challenging and hard as hell. And it's going to be really exciting.
We thank you. We thank your snake plant. We thank your wife for not writing you notes when you clean the dishes. Thank you for that. And thanks for joining us today, Vu. You've been really gracious and kind, and we appreciate counting you as a part of the family.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm going to kick this back to Amy now, and we'll continue with the day.